Okay, welcome back to our Consciousness Explorers workshop today. We're starting part two, which is more about exploring our inner life. We completed the first session with our three-function model of conscious experience. Here we have the brain and body, which is the physical, biological, and neuronal properties and functions. So with reference to physics, biology, and neuroscience, we can explain all that's happening in the brain. We know we can work on its functions. However, the functions that don't seem to fit within that basket are the cognitive properties and functions, which we included as qualia, those actual experiences, meaning the qualities of those experiences, and are processing the thoughts and ideas we have about those. So they all fit within this basket of mind, cognitive properties and functions. But we analyze that there seems to be a third set of properties and functions, which relate to the ability of consciousness to have those experiences, to be the experiencer of what is happening in our mind in terms of the qualia pictures and impressions and sensations, and in terms of the thoughts and ideas and concepts that are floating around in here. So we have the brain, the mind, and consciousness. What we're going to look at a little first is to explore a little bit of each of these properties. Someone will check. You okay? All right. We're going to look at the properties inside the brain. So there is a standard thought that you are your brain, that everything that makes you you and all your experiences of the world are somehow or other conjured up by this 1.4 kilos of gray matter. Actually, it's gray and white matter inside your skull. That's the general concept. That came from New Scientist 2017 publication, How the Brain Works. That's the standard narrative. Now, we're going to might refer to that as the brain model, that all aspects of consciousness can be explained completely by reference to the neurological functions of the brain. So we're not just asking for a theory that explains what the brain does. We need a theory of, can the brain explain qualia, and can it explain consciousness, subjective experience? So we've already shown that the qualities of qualia don't fit in the brain, and that the properties of consciousness don't fit in the brain. But we're going to look at some of the other problems that the brain has. But first, a few facts. You've got 86 billion neurons in your cortical activity. Some people say, well, whales have more neurons, and they do. But that includes all the neurons that makes up their nervous system. But in cortical terms, humans have the best number, 86 billion. So that's a lot. The synapses for each neuron, the connections that each one of these is making is between 1,000 to 10,000 other connections with other cells. How on earth is that all set up? It's incredible. Processing speed is about 268 miles per hour. You'll have 75,000 thoughts in a day. That's basically one every second of your waking life, you know? It's a lot. And with all this, the connections are something like 10 to the 15, to 10 to the power of 15. It's just an insane number of possible pathways. So you can see that that sounds like a lot of complexity. That sounds like a lot of processing power, a lot of data kind of storage power. There's a lot, it seems like a lot there, right? But still, we've got problems for all that 10 to 15 roots. So first of all, in this idea that the brain is able to explain all aspects of who we are, including consciousness and our experiences, we need to look at the direct evidence that is available for that. So having scoured the materials, having attended all the different talks and things, I've tried to compile a full list of all the aspects of direct evidence that exists for the brain. So there it is. That really is it. There is, and as I say, I've shown that to many universities over the last 10 years now, and no one has ever raised complaint on it. People say, what about such and such? But it's not direct evidence. Even, that's what that guy, Francis Crick, was saying. We're working on it. And in fact, he comes up with a theory called the astonishing hypothesis, which he says explains consciousness, because he's able to correlate certain neural activities with what people report when they experience consciousness. Correlation. No one's saying there's no correlation, but that's not causation. That does not demonstrate that consciousness comes from the brain. So there is a rationale for the brain model. And one of it is subconscious processing, that there is lots going on in your brain which you're not aware of. Yeah, well, how does that tell me that consciousness comes from the brain? Surely that suggests that me as the conscious being am only aware of part of what's going on inside. Like, I'm only aware of a fraction that's going on inside this computer. I can see the screen, but is that all that's happening? No, there's so much subconscious processing going on there, and I don't care. I'm not interested in that. I just want the pretty stuff, We just want the qualia. We as the conscious entities are not interested in the subconscious processing. Just as long as it comes on the screen of our awareness and we go, that's nice, we're happy. So that doesn't seem to get us very far. We can correlate neural activity with experiences. We've just talked about that in relationship to Francis Crick. That doesn't really get us there. Mental states affected by chemicals or disorders. Well, yes, that's a better line of argument. That's saying that, well, if we change what's happening in the brain, we change what you experience. Yeah, no problem. What have we just said? You change what you experience, not you. You haven't changed you. You've changed what you experience. We haven't created you, because you have to exist in order to have that thing that you experience. So this is an important thing, that we shouldn't think that chemicals, disorders change the actual experiencer from being the experiencer. It doesn't create consciousness. It doesn't stop consciousness. It changes what consciousness experiences. And there's huge number of ways in which our model of looking at consciousness, mind, and the brain can actually help psychology. One of them is in Alzheimer's. My father suffered from Alzheimer's in the last 2 years of his life when he was in his 90s. And, we were told to keep reminding him who he was. And we tried to do that. And I wish we hadn't. I wish to heck I'd just been allowed to talk to him and say, hey, Billy, how are you? What are you thinking about who's here today? Because he didn't recognize me at that point. He didn't recognize my mother. He thought that she was his aunt or something. He did, he said, he asked me, who's your father? And I said, well, you are. And he went mad. He just went crazy. No, how can, because he saw himself as a young boy. And I should have been talking to him in that sense of who he was. But it was still him. There's no question, it was him. The same Atma, the same entity, the same conscious entity, but experiencing himself in a very different way. So with our 3-function model, there is a chance of putting right a lot of the messing around that is going on within psychology today, because of thinking we are just the brain, because of not recognizing the self, because of not recognizing how the mind works. So this is valuable stuff we're doing. Oh, I think I left out the last one. Anesthetics cut out consciousness. That's a big one, that we can just use anesthesia, you're out, and then it comes back. But it's not anesthesia which causes consciousness. You're cutting something off. Now, we can explain what you're cutting off, but it's like saying, if I turn off a tap, So I can turn a tap on and off. Therefore, I've created water. No, you're affecting the flow of what's going on, not the actual creation of it. We'll explain this one in more detail a little bit down the line. But that's it for the justification, frankly. That's it. That's the only reasons why anyone thinks it, except that they might just want to believe it. Now, whatever their reasons might be on that. So we've already shown that the brain can't do qualia or subjective experience. Here's a few more. First thing called sensory sparseness. This relates to visual sparseness. Now, hitting the retina. Remember we showed that little picture of the world with the guy walking his dog and the lights coming into the eyes. 100 billion bits of data are coming from the outside world into our eyes at every moment. 100 billion bits. That's a huge amount of data from out there. But not all of those photons that are coming in, not all those light waves are activating the cells for various reasons. So really, once cells have been activated and signals passed from the different parts of the retina to the top of the optic nerve, you've got 6 million bits of data. That's the data loss between what's coming into your eyes and what's going down the optic nerve. So then, by the time this 6 million travels down the ganglion, 238 miles an hour, by the way, to the back of the brain, 100,000 bits of data. And used to generate a single image, about 500. That's generous. I read a paper recently where they just analyzed it, that it's probably several layers of around 20 bits at a time. That's what they're working with. So if it's that figure, it's equivalent to about 20 pixels data. Now, if you got your phone and your screen and we said, got this brand new iPhone 25, it's the latest top of the model thing, and it has 20 pixels camera and screen. What? It's nothing. So really what that means is, instead of seeing this with the clarity and vision that you see of the world, your brain's probably got that much. This is real. Your brain really has got that much to play with. But that's not what you experience. You experience this. So there has to be some kind of image enhancing system. And the neuroscientists know this. Now, they try to explain that in terms of some things which the brain can do, but we know the brain can't do qualia, so never mind enhancing qualia, But we look at it a different way. This is then connected to another problem called the binding problem. How do we experience a unified collection of disparate sensory inputs? And a nice example is kind of sitting in front of a fire, which is a fireplace here, when the fire's burning and you can feel the heat, you can see the light and the flames dancing, you can smell the wood smoke, It's a real sensory bath, a real fire, isn't it? It's wonderful, and the crackling of the logs and everything. It's something is very comforting and about it. But the interesting thing is that all those different inputs, the warmth is coming from our skin, skin sensation, ears, eyes, nose, they're all feeding into the brain. But we're experiencing it as one unified thing. What's pulling all that together when the different parts of the brains have got different elements of the picture? So no one understands how that is bound together into a single experience. Still the binding problem. And there is a further problem in this, and that is time lag. Now watch this. Did you see and hear that at the same time? Yeah? Pretty well, pretty well. I mean, yes, the physicists among you will say, well, light goes faster than sound, so I would have caught the light first. Actually, that's a very small effect in this sort of distance. The brain actually still has to process that information, which has come to the eye and come to the ear. So it's not just a question of when that stuff out there gets here, It's a question of when it gets back in here and is dealt with. So what you've got is the Numb Skulls. This is from the Beano in the UK. Cartoon. It used to be great. This is the eye department. There's a guy in here and he's receiving light in here. And this is the ear department. And he's kind of watching out for things. Now, so can you imagine the situation? The light is coming into the eye department and coming into the ear department. Who can process it quicker? What would you think? Think about data. Think about data. Why is that? No, it's the other way around, actually. But that's got nothing to do with it. The movement in the medium outside is no longer relevant. It's a question of which of these guys can do their work quickest. That's what we're now looking at. Which is dealing with the bigger packet of data? Sound is a bigger packet than a video? Video is a bigger packet, isn't it? No, that's already happened. That's already happened in the ear. Now we're into the brain processing bit. So now he's got the same data pretty well at the same time as that inside the brain. The sound is processed quicker. And do you know what the time difference between these two is? Half a second. Half a second. Now, half a second doesn't sound a long time. If I said, we'll have pizza here in half a second, you'd be very happy. But half a second in, it's like you see that, clap, clap, clap. That's the difference. But that's not what you experience. You experience them together. But the brain hasn't processed the picture yet. All right? So this is really weird. So, you can imagine there's a kind of discussion. Here's brain department. He's saying, I hear we've got something that's just come in from outside. Ear department, have you got that processed, the sound bit? Yep, we've got that ready. Okay, just touching bases with eye department. No, we're just working on it. We'll be there in a minute, just now coming, sort of thing. Wait a minute, but we want to experience it now. We need it this moment. We can't wait half a second, for that to happen. And we're talking about every moment you experience half a second delay. So the question is, how is this tied together? Now, there's only two options. If you want to believe that the brain is doing the whole job, you've only got two options. The first one is that you experience the world on catch-up. That means that what the brain has done is hold the data from the sound for half a second in order to match it with the video later, and then present it to you, the clap. That means you, whoever you are in the brain model, is experiencing the world half-second delay. Now, there's a big philosophical price to pay for that. This is their analysis. You basically just said the you is pretty well illusory. Certainly, it's got no agency, no free will, and no influence. It's just an absent later. It's like, you're just the audience watching your video on catch-up, on TV on catch-up, like that. So that doesn't sound like what I experience. The other one is we do experience in real time the brain's best predictive guess. Basically, the brain hasn't got the visuals yet. It knows something has happened. It's got the sound, but it hasn't got the visuals. Therefore, what do? You make it up. And therefore, what you're experiencing of the world is simply a basic guess about the world. And the price to pay is you've no certainty of your experiences. That it's just a guess. So, some people believe, and this is kind of the standard statement, the brain makes its best guess at what is going on based on the input of the senses. Anil Seth, who's the top neuroscientist in the UK, puts it in a different way. He goes even further. He says, our perception is an hallucination, partially moderated by sensory input. We haven't got the data to have the experience we're having of the world at the moment. And so basically the brain's just thinking, I think I'm in a room. I think there's some people here. I think they're doing this. You know, I'm picking up some little visual kind of image. All right, but here's the picture. Here's what it seems like to me. It's rich. So you can wait. Yeah. So our perception is just an hallucination. That's, you know, that's a pretty grim picture of who we are. It doesn't square with our experiences. And so what the brain can't do, not only qualia, subjective experience, it can't deal with the richness of our sensory perception. That's the sparseness problem. It can't deal with real life, real-time experience. There's a time lag problem. It can't give you veridical perception and agency at the same time. You know, either you're experiencing it, it's real, but you haven't got agency because you're experiencing it so late in the day, but you have no free will, or you're experiencing, you've got agency, in which case you don't have a real kind of picture of the world to act in. How can we do anything in the world if this is the incapability of our brain? How is it we have managed to survive? You know, we think we're clumsy enough as it is, but we do amazing things as humans. All creatures do. They're all dealing with the same problem. So, theories of consciousness. We're going to look at the 4 different categories of theories of consciousness. We're not going to get into them in detail. That's not needed here. But it's just worth understanding how these different theories deal with trying to explain consciousness, because there's something to be revealed in each. The first one, they diminish what is meant by consciousness. Now, that means they say consciousness is just information, intelligence, mental content. It's just the experience, or it's the processing of that experience. Now, all those things are included within our experience of consciousness, but it's not consciousness per se. So this reduces consciousness to things like memories or just thoughts, feelings and emotions and experiences, processing ability, metacognition, information, or it says it's just personality traits and psychological states. Now, all absolutely connected with what we experience, but not the experiencer. These are the things we witness. These are the things we observe, the things we see, not the faculty of being able to have that experience. So that's why we call that diminish. There's a lot of, and most of the neuroscience approaches really is trying to look at what's going on with these little things here. And it's valuable, it's informative, but it's not an explanation of consciousness. Next one is Conjur. This used to be the favorite, that basically invoking the magic powers of non-scientific terms. And those terms included emergent property, an epiphenomenon, or the current one, it supervenes on brain activity. Now, ask for a definition of these and how they come about. There is nothing. I remember we were doing a radio program, and it was a discussion on consciousness and things like that. And we had a professor from Oxford University on the line, and I was in the studio in Cardiff with the presenter. And we heard the professor down the line say, yes, we know that, and he did have this voice, yes, we know that consciousness is simply an epiphenomenon of the brain, because he was trying to deny the possibility of what we're going to be talking about in a little bit, out-of-body experiences. So the presenter, poor guy, what's an epiphenomenon, you know? And I had to explain to him that an epiphenomenon is a fancy term that you give to claiming that something is created by something else when you haven't got a shred of evidence or explanation of how that could have come about. That's what an epiphenomenon is. You may think I'm being a little harsh there, but actually we have to be harsh. We have to call out things like this. It's giving a fancy name and saying consciousness is simply an epiphenomenon. It's an emergent property of the brain. But we haven't a slightest shred of evidence that that's possible. We've just seen it's practically speaking impossible that that could be the case. But certainly we have no evidence for that. So to make that type of claim within a theory is simply conjuring, it's hand waving. A lot of philosophers and scientists that often complain to me that they hear people talk about the soul and they say that's just hand waving. This is hand waving also. It's not a lot different, and we're not trying to do hand waving of any type. We'll come to that. Deny. Another possible situation is you deny that consciousness exists, or more precisely, claim that consciousness is a virtual illusion. It does not effectively exist. It's not what we think it is. That's really what they're saying, because no one can really deny consciousness. They certainly can't deny qualia, right? But they say that your sense of consciousness is an illusion, right? They say it has no efficacy or agency, and the rationalization, if you can't explain consciousness by reference to the brain, then consciousness cannot exist. We had a recent video from Susan Blackmore explaining this, that she was saying basically we know the self doesn't exist. And the reason we know the self doesn't exist is because there's nothing in the brain that could account for the self. Now, that doesn't make any sense. What we would suggest is, wait a minute, you're saying, and she's already just said, we always keep coming back to thinking we are the self. We can't get away from it. It's natural. Okay, we take that as an axiom, that it's natural to accept ourselves as the self. And you've just said that brain can't explain the self. So you've got self is there, and you can't explain it from the brain. So that plus that equals no self. No, wait a minute. 2 plus 2 equals 3. No, that's not very good analysis. So that's the type of denying that can go on. And the fourth is promise. And frankly, this is what's going on now. This is the current thing, that someday we will have a theory on the physical source of consciousness, perhaps in some new neurophysiology or some new discovery of how the brain works, or so maybe we get little ideas of this works and this works and this works, we put them all together and it builds up into an explanation, or we'll create artificial consciousness, which doesn't necessarily deal with the problem that we're trying to deal with here. But this is kind of fairly standard, that it's promissory. And both people like Dawkins and others have tried to kind of say, we don't understand consciousness well enough and we don't understand matter well enough, so of course we don't have a theory about it yet. The thing is, we do understand enough about consciousness and how we experience it to need to have a theory. And we know enough about what the brain can't do in order to at least want to explore a different type of theory than the brain model. This promises in a very recent leader in the neuroscience news. However, despite advances, the neuroscience of consciousness is in its early stages, and understanding how neuronal activity gives rise to subjective experiences remains a significant challenge. This is basically the disclaimer that now comes. Yeah, we're talking about everything else around the brain, everything else regarding conscious experience, but we're not dealing with this. And we're here as consciousness explorers because that's what we're interested in. Me as a subjective experiencer, that's what I want to know about. And if these guys haven't got anything to tell me about it, nope, all power to their elbow, as we say in Ireland, which is to do with drinking, which it would be in Ireland. But all power to them. They can carry on. We're not trying to stop them. We're not trying to think. But let's not look to them to find answers to the questions that we have about our own existence. So diminish, conjure, deny, promise. All theories fit into one of those categories. So now we look a little bit at the mind. Okay? What is the role of the mind? We had an interesting presentation from Bernardo Castro the other day. Agree with, he's got some very nice analysis. He's very much of the flavor that mental properties cannot be reduced to the brain. And he gave this analogy, which I think is useful. He regards the mind like this, like the inside of a pilot's cockpit. And although there are windows, they're actually blanked off. He thinks you don't have access to the external world except through your senses. And what the senses are doing is sending data into the cockpit. So the cockpit is like the mind, right? And so that if there's actual temperature outside, what you experience is something on a dial saying 20 degrees, -5 degrees, whatever it is, right? So you are reading the dials in your mind about the world. And all the other things, the thoughts, they're just messages coming through. The volition is you being able to send some of your wishes, into the mind and activate things outside. Memory recall. Memory, that's an interesting one. Is memory present within the brain? Again, there's no theory for that yet. We've got no theory. We've got a bit of RAM, what we call working memory. It lasts about 2 seconds. The brain can hold about 2 seconds worth of data circulating. But where memories are stored, it's a little weird. We know that when you fall asleep, there's firing of neurons connected to particular experiences that you had during the day, firing. And that's why might, in the middle of your dreams, you might actually go through those things again. But the interesting thing is that in the brain, that fires big, smaller, 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 and finally just down to one neuron firing. Now, can that one neuron contain all the richness of your memory recall? Certainly, that's the question. So, or is that firing in such a way that the mind is taking that information and storing it? So there's a question of whether it's the brain doing the storage or whether it's the mind doing the storage of that. Anyway, mind is interface. That's how we've been looking at it. The mind is a non-sentient interface system. It is not sentient. You are the sentient thing. You're the witness of it. It's processing stuff in a nice way for you to experience. It is not sentient. But you know what? It almost seems like it is. It is so powerful that the mind is practically speaking artificial consciousness. It's not consciousness. It's not sentient, but it mimics consciousness so well that you become captivated by it. You allow your consciousness to experience what is there in the mind, and you feel that's sufficient for my conscious awareness. We'll be talking a bit more on that one in a minute. It facilitates communication of information between the body-brain complex, i.e. body-brain, as a whole, and the Atma. And I haven't mentioned the Atma yet, but the conscious being. It represents to the Atma the data received by our senses and processed by the brain. So it's representing the data of the world to us. And that's what that cockpit analogy was trying to say, that what we're experiencing is a representation of the world by our mind, not the world itself. It's obviously related to the world itself. It's obviously related well enough that I think my glasses are here, I can pick them up. So we've got some good relation going. And the mind has cognitive abilities beyond the brain, and we'll prove that in a minute. Mind has a life of its own. My mind is like my internet browser. 17 tabs are open. 3 of them are frozen, and I have no idea where the music's coming from. Isn't it, you hear that music going on in your head. So, want to talk about how we can know that the mind has powers that the brain doesn't have. Never mind the qualia and everything else. Can we show that scientifically? right? Here, this is a system called remote viewing, or sometimes called remote perception. Um, in the 1970s, these guys, Harold Puthoff and Russell Karg, were working at the Stanford Research Institute. They had a thing called the International Human Consciousness Research Program, looking at various aspects of consciousness, particularly on the outer limits, of it. CIA heard about it. They had heard that France, Israel, Russia, and other places had psychic spies. And they thought, we better get ourselves some of this. We don't want to be at a disadvantage. We need to know at least what's possible through all of this. So they gave $50 million to Stanford, and there was a 5-year research program that these guys did, and they worked out a whole system, came back to the CIA, said, here's a system of intelligence gathering through by the mind. Basically, it's remote viewing means to gather information about objects and targets that are distant in time and space, i.e., to gather information about things that your senses cannot get, that your instrumentation possibly cannot get. So in 2005, I was running this place here, Buckland Hall in Wales, beautiful kind of place in the middle of the mountains there. And a friend said, I know this David Morehouse. Could I invite him to come and do a course at your place on remote viewing? He worked for the CIA for years as a psychic spy. He broke away from that, and he's now just wants to teach remote viewing because it shows people the potential of who they are in the mind. And I thought that sounds really nice. Of course, that's the sort of thing we happily host at Buckland Hall. Can I join in? So we did 5 days of what's called coordinate remote viewing, which is a fairly simple version. And then later on, we did a further 5 days of extended remote viewing, which was a technique that the CIA developed as a development of the original Stanford system. So I have to say, I was prepared to be intrigued by it. I was flabbergasted. The system was just unbelievably powerful. And it really set me off on how the mind works. It really kind of helped bring in the picture of how the mind is able to access information. And when you understand how this works, you can understand other aspects of what we've been talking about, how the mind can give you real-time experiences which are rich in information, because the image enhancing system is facilitated through this remote viewing. So let me tell you a little bit about it. Remote viewing, this is the metaphysical principle that they used. That the information that defines the properties of every object, every place, every event is present in a subtle state of reality as data in an information field. Now, we always just think that reality is just the hard stuff. But what this is revealing is that all the hard stuff is and we're going to have to get into this a bit more in this section, and in the next session as well, that everything that exists is energy and information, and we'll do a lot on that in the afternoon session. And so everything that exists not only has its hard object form, but it has a hard object form because it exists as data in an information field. In the same way as I can have data about, say, a piece of paper, a document I want, it exists as data in my computer, but it can be printed as a hard object outside, and the two correlate. But that object that I print can only exist in the way it does because I've got data about it. But no one can read the data, no one can see the data, no one can appreciate it until it is printed in physical form. So similarly, this world is a printout of the data in the information field. So you can either experience the world directly by your senses, or you can ask the mind to go and get the information directly. That sounds pretty powerful, doesn't it? And it works. So here's a kind of an analogy that helps on this. David Morehouse explained this. He said, imagine a completely calm pond, and a pebble is thrown in, it sets up a series of ripples, right? Now, if I'm expert at reading ripples, I can look at those ripples and say, I know how big the stone was. I know which direction it came in. I can even tell you if it's round or sharp. I can't actually, I'm not a reader of ripples. But theoretically, I could be, couldn't I? You know, because all the information about the event of that stone hitting the water is now contained in this ripple. At least a lot of it. And it just spreads out everywhere. So you can imagine it spreads out throughout the whole lake. Now, do I need to be at the place where the stone hit the water in order to read the ripples? No, anywhere. So it's holographic in that respect. Now imagine that suddenly there's a big quick freeze and the lake freezes with all the ripples in it. Do I now need to be there at the time it happened? I can read it after. So similarly, you can read information about any event in the universe by accessing the information field. You don't have to be there at the place. You don't have to be there at the time of the event. You can get that information. The information is preserved, every bit of it. That's the theory behind this. So remote viewing is not a spiritual practice. It's nothing transcendental. It's not spiritual. It's a practical mental faculty. Anyone can do it. Anyone. In fact, you all do it as part of your day-to-day life, your day-to-day sensory perception. You're doing it at every moment. Your mind is gathering data and adding to what your senses have got in order to give you the richness of qualia that you're experiencing. So not a special psychic ability. Really, it shouldn't be called paranormal. It's absolutely natural. Now, it can be tested empirically. And I've been working with various groups in Europe. And we did a session in last year in India also. And we can set up with new viewers, show you how to view, and then run you through empiric tests to show that you've actually contacted the targets that we're talking about. And we can do it double blind. We can do it as a clinical setting where experimenters are checking on what we're doing to ensure that there's no messing around and that the data beats chance significantly. We normally do it with, actually, I'll explain the system to you very quickly. I think we've got a couple of minutes we saved from the morning, and this is worth doing. Worth hearing about? Yeah. Okay, if we were doing it, we would put you in a meditative position. You'd be sitting at a table, you'd be wide awake, but through some yogic breathing, we'd help bring your brainwave from beta, which is kind of current, normal, day-to-day activity. Gamma is hyper, and alpha is more subdued. You're wide awake, you're just chilled. Somehow or other in the alpha state, and you get this by chanting. We've done EEGs with devotees chanting, and they drop very quickly into the alpha state. Because in the alpha state, your senses are still active, but they just don't seem to be that bothersome. You know, they're sending, and it doesn't seem to be that interesting when the information's coming in, you know? So you just feel there's more peace in your mind in this state. And in that state, then we just give you what we call a coordinate. The coordinate is a set of numbers that is linked to a target that you know nothing about. And I don't even have to know anything about it. I just have to know that that set of numbers is meant to represent that target. It's a completely randomized set of numbers. It means nothing in contextual terms. It's just, we press the random generator, it gives us this number. We say this number is going to represent such and such a target, which could be a place, a thing, an event, an emotion. You know, we can really target anything. So if you're in this meditative state, and I then just tell you that number, guess what your mind does? Goes off and gathers it. It just immediately just goes to that target and starts to receive. And the whole trick about remote viewing is just allowing yourself as the witness of your thoughts to be a receiver, because things are coming into your mind very foggily at first. And it's like the aperture is tiny, and then just bit by bit, if you follow the protocols that Stanford did, they're brilliant because they help you open up that aperture by basically following their way of receiving the information. You're in the right frame of mind just for letting it come and letting that the mind's eye open up to what is being received. Too often, of course, we start to think about that data. Am I making it up? Am I imagining it? What does this mean? Is it, oh, I think I know what this is. Oh, I think, and all that sort of crap is really detrimental because you're putting your thoughts, overlaying what you're trying to be as a recipient of data. You're trying to kind of just allow your mind to download. But if you're doing all this other processing on top of that, the download gets lost. And that's the main problem that devotees face, or anyone faces, when they are doing this process. But if you just are willing just to let it come, it just gets amazing. And there's 6 stages that the Stanford worked out in order that you go through over an hour and a half of a viewing. And by the end of the 6th stage, you can basically see the target in totality. You can sense all sorts of things about it, not just visual. You're hearing, you're feeling, you're smelling things, perhaps, if that's significant at the place. You can sense its time arc. You can sense what it used to be, what it is now, where it's going. It's absolutely astounding. To do a remote viewing on a place is much better than going to that place, because you feel you know it much more deeply than can be described in books or in visits. Anyway, no, the random number is linked to the target by intention, and that's the key. It's that someone's mind has said this number is that target. Otherwise, the number doesn't mean anything. But someone has to link that. It's not the person who's giving you the number necessarily, and it's not the viewers themselves. Someone else can set that. So I usually have another guy who sets up the targets. I don't know then what the targets are. He sends me sets of them. He doesn't know which one I'm going to use. So the viewers don't know, but they're able to. Then when I show them a set of 3, then they're able to say, we saw this one. And some people are so accurate on it. It's incredible. And in just working with newcomers, against potential 33% hit rate, we've been running at around 55. Not huge, but very statistically, that's several sigmas deviation, even with the number of trials we've used. So a lot more can be done on that. Anyway, tested empirically, doesn't contravene the laws of physics, as we will see. It indicates that the non-neural mind can gain subtle information about the physical world. So that's the mind. That indicates it has abilities beyond the brain. Now we look a little bit at consciousness, right? And we're saying, all right, we know that these are distinctive functions. We know that we can't explain them in terms of what the brain can do. We can't even explain them in terms of what the mind can do. So what if consciousness itself is a fundamental principle of reality, distinct from physical matter and even from mental stuff, whatever that is, right? So we're going to define a field of consciousness, because that's what you do in science. Everything becomes a field. And like other fields, you have a fundamental particle or entity, and we're calling that the Atma. And we use the word Atma because it has precision. So Atma is the smallest unit composed of and possessing a quantum of the property of consciousness. Does that help with that definition? Okay. And the Atma is an individual entity of consciousness. We're not just experiencing consciousness as if it was something different. We are an entity of consciousness. That's why we have those experiences, because we are conscious. And we are the seer, the witness, the observer, the knower, all those things we identified earlier. The original self. And we're going to look at a little bit on that in a minute. And non-neural, non-physical. So let's have look at some evidence that consciousness is non-neural. Now, this first one is to do with hydrocephalus, which is the situation where often during the development of the child within the womb, there is a release of liquid within the ventricles of the developing brain. And if so much liquid is being generated, the cortical activity, the cortical development doesn't happen. And in Noah Ward here, this was his brain at birth, just that little, that's the skull, the white one, and there's a little gray patch around there. That's all the brain he had. Practically nothing. Now, Noah demonstrated being a happy, social, nice kid, a little bit slow in some development, but no one would say he wasn't conscious. In as much as all of us, if we're going to recognize anyone as conscious, he was recognized as conscious. So this doesn't prove that consciousness is non-neural, but what it does do is indicate that for those who say that consciousness is a product of very complex brain activity with its 86 billion neurons, you can have consciousness without that. So that's the important part from that. Then another one is the AWARE project, which it's not defined here, but it's awareness after resuscitation study, right? So this was done by a guy called Sam Parnia, and he studied over 2,000 patients who had lost all brain function following cardiac arrest. Cardiac arrest isn't always linked to, it means the heart stopped, but it doesn't necessarily mean because of heart attacks. It can be because of whatever cause of death. The heart stops, right? And so people go through cardiac arrest, and since 1969, our resuscitation techniques have improved, and people have been able to kind of trace back to around about that time as when the first reports came from people who were waking up after resuscitation saying, wow, I've just been through something very strange, you know? And we're going to talk about near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences in a minute. But those are the things we're starting to get reports about. Now, of course, at first it came in very slowly because no one wants anyone to think they're nuts, especially when you're already in a hospital, and you've just been woken up after death. No, I think we should, you're definitely nutty, we're wasting our time resuscitating you, No, people were hesitant. But this study, happened in more recent years. It went over 15 hospitals, the UK, Austria, and here in America. And here's what they came to the conclusion. The study of cardiac arrest survivors provides evidence that consciousness continues for some time after the heart stops and brain has flatlined. Now, brain cells are a little different to other cells. Other cells have their own way of processing energy from oxygen. And they can kind of, the cells of your body can survive very happily without a lot of blood for a while. They've got enough internal supply. Brain cells do not have a kind of oxygen supply internally. They rely on the blood vessels. 20% of your blood in your body is circulating through your brain. Something like 100 miles of capillaries and things, because the brain, has to deliver oxygenated blood to all the brain cells. And when the heart stops, that's what stops. So the brain cells are shutting down within 20, 30 seconds. Basically, they can't function after that. They don't die, but they're just no longer functioning. There's no electricity. That's why it's flatlined. And the interesting thing is what happens during that flatline time. Now, in waking up the resuscitation patients, 4% said nothing. 4% said nothing. That means 96% felt something. 39% had some perception, but they weren't very specific about it. They just felt, I'm here. Yeah, I'm still alive, Something was going on. 46% related to a broad range of mental recollections. 9% had near-death experiences. 2% had out-of-body experiences. Now, we have to be careful with all this data because these are very high percentages. And I think they're valid, but we are going to hone in on what is the most kind of convincing aspect of this data. Because there is a situation that people are claiming that while you're being resuscitated, things are starting to happen within your body, the blood is starting to be pumped, and during that moment, you're going to have some weird experience. So are all these weird experiences happening during the period of resuscitation when there is blood happening and electrical activity has been stimulated, but you haven't quite said, I'm back? We know dreams and things can happen in a flash. So could a lot of these experiences be happening at that time? Answer is possibly, yes. But it doesn't explain everything. And let's look at the things that it doesn't explain. These are the core experiences of near-death experiences. Some people are trying to call them now REDs. In fact, Parney is trying to call them recollection of an experience of death. I think that's misleading. I think a lot of others do. That no one has actually died. Their heart has stopped, but they're back. And it seems to be the same entity back, same person. So we can't say they've really died. And it really demonstrates that we haven't got a good definition of life at the end, death. And we know we haven't got a good definition in science and medicine on life at the beginning. So we got problems. We don't understand how life fits into, life and death fits into the period of the existence of our body. Anyway, core experiences of a near-death experience. Serenity and lucidity. People really, generally like it. There are some bad experiences, but majority are of this type. Seeing deceased relations is often a thing. Now, there's a couple of these. We're going to come back to that. Bright light or tunnel. Yeah, interesting. They meet a being of light and love, someone who they recognize as their well-wisher and either is encouraging them or telling them at a certain point, time to go back. In that case, they reach a threshold of no return. They seem to come to a point and they know if they take that next step, there's no going back. And often it's that being who says, no, not your time to go back. And often they don't want to. This is too nice. So those, you could try and explain those experiences in terms of what's going on during resuscitation. However, certain experiences that they have, sometimes in seeing deceased people, it has happened that people have reported seeing someone they believe who they meet who has died, and then coming back and not only then finding out that the person died whilst they were in this coma or in this situation. They could not have known about that. Sometimes they get information from these relatives about stuff they couldn't have known elsewhere. So that it's those type of experiences that start to help to clarify if this is actually something which is happening on the mind state, or is it something we can explain physically? Out-of-body experiences, freedom from pain, seeing your own body, heightened senses, movement and will, deep memory of the event, and verifiable veridical experiences, not wishing to go back. I'll tell you one about one friend of mine. He was having an operation for a hernia, and he went to the doctor and the anaesthetist, and the anaesthetist says, don't worry, you're going to be under, you won't feel a thing, no problem. So he was in the middle of the operation. He woke up. He could feel the surgeons operating on his stomach. And at first it was just, well, that's weird. We could, feel what's going on down there. And then the pain came, and he wanted to kind of shout out to the people that this hurts. I'm in pain, and he couldn't. He couldn't blink. He couldn't move because basically what the anesthetic had done is frozen his body, frozen his brain, but his mind was awake, and he was experiencing this pain, and it was just getting worse, and he was just exploding. He just thought, I can't take it anymore. I'm going to die. I've got to. And then he was out. Then he found himself floating, looking down at his body. Pain had gone. And he was watching. Now he was watching the guys working on this body down here, thinking. And he started thinking, that's rather interesting. And movement. What can I do? In this situation, I can float. He starts swimming around. He realized that just by thinking about his mind, it would go here and there. And he thought, I have that friend who's he said he was in the waiting room. He said he would wait for me there and pray for me while I was having surgery. I'll go and see what he's thinking. And he found himself, he didn't know the way around the hospital, but he found himself in the waiting room to see his friend. And he thought, I'd like to do something to tell my friend that he's there. Maybe I can knock something over. He was trying to play with things in the room. He couldn't do it. So he said, I'll just give him a big hug. And then he thought, I better get back and see what's happening with my body. I am actually here for an important purpose. So time to go back and see what's happening in the theatre. So he was back watching the guys doing the thing, and he saw the doctor, doing the operation, and that it's such a routine thing for them that they weren't worried about it. And the doctor started to explain his new golf swing that he'd developed, and he was saying, yes, it goes like this. And as he did that, he cut an artery inside his stomach, and the blood just started pumping out now. And just looking, you're seeing your body and the blood and then the mood in the theater had completely changed. They were all happy, and now they were panic that we're about to lose this guy, and just thought, well, God, if this is when I'm supposed to go, okay, what can I do? And he heard a voice saying, no, it's not your time. You still got some more work to do. So, but he still in anxiety. But he watched as then he kind of felt himself being drawn back into the body, and didn't go. And then he was out. And then he woke up, and I'm here, and he's been wheeled away by the anaesthetist saying, I told you wouldn't feel a thing. So later on, he talked to the doctor and said, I know what you did. What do you mean? I saw what happened in the, you can't have, I saw what you did. You did this, this, and the other. And the guy freaked out. He said, don't worry. I'm not here just to make some litigation and claim against you. I'm all right. At least I'm alive. But I just wanted you to know this is what happened. He wrote down everything as soon as he woke up. He documented every thought, every moment of this, because it is significant. There's a deeper memory of this event. And that's actually true of anyone who goes through an NDE, or it changes them. You can't say this is just illusory or incidental. It changes people very, very deeply. They've kind of been to the threshold of death and realized, I'm not this body. I can carry on and still exist. I will not cease to exist. So it's powerful. It has its, a friend of mine who has done research in Cardiff and in Wales. She was studying at a university as a trainee nurse, and she was given permission by the authorities there to basically explore resuscitation stories for her PhD thesis. And she was allowed to work in the ICU and the accident and emergency. And wherever there was someone who had cardiac arrest, she was going from one bed to the next, just waiting for something to happen. And when they woke up, she was there ready to interview them. And she wrote a whole thesis on this. And very interestingly, what she was able to do was deal with another type of complaint. Have I got them here? No, I haven't. Sorry, I haven't written them up. Deal with another type of complaint that's sometimes used, that maybe these experiences are just a lack of oxygen. Maybe it's CO2 present in the blood system, which is creating these things. But she was able to correlate experiences that people had of things that they couldn't have known about sensor-wise during flatlined. She was able to correlate the timings, because all these guys in an ICU they're being monitored. So this was a kind of unique situation, that you've got the patients already hooked up as your subjects, so that you can check various things. And she was able to confirm that while they said they were having these particular experiences, their CO2 and oxygen levels in their blood were normal. No issue. Right? So, and in the resuscitation process, the real conclusion these days is not so much that well, some people say that it causes the experiences, which doesn't tally, but it seems to do more damage to remembrance or recall of the experiences. So that's why it's really important to get people as soon as possible. All right, probably lots more that could be said on that, but other researchers on this one, Bruce Grayson, University of Virginia, on Tuesday, myself and another of our researchers, Kunal, are going to the university to meet up with Jim Tucker and others at their Department of Perceptual Studies. Pim van Lommel in Utrecht is a cardiologist and has done huge meta studies of these, looking at all the different, bringing them all together, all the different studies. This is Penny Sartori at Swansea, who did that one in the ICU. Atma and time. We meditated on this earlier, that I am the persistent witness throughout my life. Right? Now, time facilitates change. That's what time does. It facilitates change. That's how we're going to look at it in this session and this afternoon. That, okay, time, space, all wrapped together, fine. Understanding the measurement and the passing of time, fine. But really, what you have to think of is that if you've got a situation, static, if there is no time, nothing, no change, just, So we need time in order for things to happen, right? So here's our non-temporal observer, right? Sitting here watching what's going on in the screen here. So the ball comes in and it's rolling, time just allows it to bump into the blocks, right? Time has allowed each moment to be different and for things then to change in their situation, and our experience is watching that. But time has changed all of that, but we haven't changed. So the jurisdiction of time, if we have these different properties, the world and body, which we group together, physical and biological, we've got the mind, cognitive, consciousness. So out of these three groups, which is under the jurisdiction of time? Now, I think very quickly we would say, well, we know that time allows things in this world to change, right? Everything, I'm moving around, things are happening here and elsewhere. We seem to be, the world is a domain of time. Our body seems to be in the world of time. It changes over time, right? So no problem with that. And really, we can extend it to mind as well, because what's in our mind changes from moment to moment. New qualia, new ideas, new thoughts, all the time. 70,000 of them a day, we said. So that's the domain of time. What about consciousness? Is consciousness also in the domain of time? If we define consciousness as experiences, yes, that's in here. But if we define consciousness as the experiencer of changing experiences, then we have the observer outside of time, but shining the light of our awareness on this. And I'm going to use that sort of connection between the Atma and the mind in future as we develop this diagram throughout the afternoon. Okay, so this is the Atma, a non-temporal observer of time. It's a key property that consciousness has, which does not belong to these properties, these functions. So this is important. You are the non-temporal consciousness. You're a non-temporal entity of consciousness. And we know that we can meditate on how it changes. Our body is changing throughout all these circumstances. And we have felt ourselves, we probably didn't know much about that, but we started to experience what was going on here and here. But just because consciousness is inhabiting all those things and experiencing the changes that the body goes through, doesn't mean that consciousness changes during that time. It doesn't, and if consciousness is the constant observer of all of that, when it gets to this point, there's no reason why it stops being a non-temporal conscious entity. It just may not be there. It may have to go somewhere else. And that brings us into issues of, well, where might the consciousness go? And one study that demonstrates that consciousness can survive the full kind of event of death is the experiments done by Ian Stevenson, originally at the University of Virginia, which unfortunately has passed away now. He did a study of over 2,000 cases of spontaneous remembrance of children. And a lot of these were in India or in the East, where there's already an understanding of reincarnation. And that's natural, because if kids start talking that I remember being somewhere else, I have a different family, I have a different name, you're not my mom and dad, it's pretty heavy to hear. We've all heard that. So when kids say these things in a culture where reincarnation is not well known, the tendency will be to, yeah, that's very nice. You are someone else, imaginary friend and all, whatever. They put it down, and the kid just goes through, it's just a phase. Whereas in other places, they may take it more seriously. But there are a lot of these cases where outside those cultures, some very, very good ones. Here's one that I like because it illustrates a couple of things. This is Titu Singh. And he started telling his parents, I actually have another family. I have a wife and kids. Oh, yeah, that's right, yeah. Yeah, my name's Suresh Verma. Okay. And I live in Agra. And I've got a radio shop there, So the family are hearing all this, and they weren't entertaining it very well. But his older brother thought, I'm going to Agra, check it out. Sure enough, he finds Suresh's radio shop. Okay, maybe there's many of them. Suresh is a very common name, no big deal. So he goes inside and says, I'd like to speak to Suresh. And the lady says, oh, I'm sorry. He died some time ago. I'm his wife, Uma. Can I help you? I says, well, I don't know how to say this, but my little brother is claiming that in his last life he was Suresh. And of course, everyone said, well, that's interesting, And they managed to agree a meeting of the families, which is, this is heavy psychological stuff, you're going through bereavement and everything else. But the families agreed to meet. So Titu's family brought him with all the relatives to Suresh's family. Now, you know how it works in India, that whenever there is some event, everyone's there. So all the village, all the kids, all the relatives are there. It's not just we're going to one person's little home, meeting, few to a few. No, everyone was there. So immediately Titu arrived at this place in Agra. He immediately, out of everyone, recognized his wife and went up to see her and would sit with her in a way that was completely ridiculous for a small child with a strange lady. He was sitting with her and chatting. And then amongst all the kids that were running and playing, and they were kept separately, and no one was saying anything about them. They wanted to check this because it's not that they were skeptical in reincarnation. They always wanted to be skeptical. Are this family trying to weasel in on our, inheritance here or whatever? There's things to be considered. So all the kids were running around together, and he said, "Oh, there's so and so, and there's so." And remember, it was about 15 years after he died. So he was spotting kids who were 15 years older than they were when he last saw them. So pretty amazing story. And Ian Stevenson has got huge number of these cases. Not all the cases can be as easily verified as this one. Some of them better. Some of them can be correlated with police reports, autopsy reports, and those are the ones that really matter. Where they can, a person has very specific remembrances. This is what happened. I was in such and such a place. This was my name. This is what happened to me, and you can kind of correlate all these things together. And that's the kind of the gold standard that Ian Stevenson and others are looking for in these. We've actually got a new initiative having another go at this type of investigation in India to look at it from the Indian perspective, because these are Western academics going over there, and sometimes they may not have been able to get the information or as much as they could. So we have some local teams now doing this, starting up this project again. It's harder now because of the internet. Because if your kid's now saying them, oh yes, So the danger is the parents doing research and feeding the kids or colluding with the kids. So you need to get situations where there has not been any prior kind of research. That's the problems of today's research. Now, this is what Ian Stevenson said himself about this. He said, look, we are seeing these individuals remembering lives. We can correlate things. We can verify that their memories of what that person's life was were real. You could say, you could make up various reasons why this isn't reincarnation, but let's look at all the different alternative options to reincarnation being the explanation, because that's what you do as a scientist. And Ian Stevenson and the guys in Virginia are very dedicated to what they're doing. So he said, normal explanations of this, is it just coincidence that they got it right? That's stretching it. Are the accounts invented? Very quickly you can see if they are, and if they can't be verified, we're not worrying about them anyway. But if they're being verified, then they're not invented. Are they imposed on the children? That's a very important one to kind of ensure that there hasn't been that type of collusion. Is it something that some people are trying to do to fake and to be mischievous? You've got to watch that out. So he would be very careful for all those points. And then he says there are also some paranormal explanations, alternatives. Now, is this some form of extrasensory perception? We've just talked about remote viewing. Is it possible to remote view and see another person's life? Yes. But you experience it as a viewer. Whereas these people are reporting it as their personal experience. That's the difference in this. It's not some connection of, with the memory field or something like that, which is pretty far out. Anyway, that still proves the point we've just been trying to make about the mind being non-neural. But that doesn't seem to account for the subjectivity involved in this. Possession. Are these people kind of, well, that just raises a whole different kind of idea. But it's not that this individual thinks that someone else has come in and saying this. They think they're saying it. And it doesn't seem that there's a secondary person. They're very happy in who they are now and just thinking this is it's what I remember. And is that possession by someone who's had a previous life? In which case you've proved the point anyway. Right? So maternal impressions being passed down. There's lots of good examples where the connection between parents and the other families are not related. If they were within the same family group, same line of descendants, you might be able to invoke something along those lines, but not when they're distantly related. So this is reincarnation. Its official title for this type of reincarnation is metempsychosis. Doesn't sound like a great name, but it's reincarnation via transmigration of the conscious entity along with the mind, right? So this is reincarnation disappointment. Things don't always go the way you planned. But it is worth talking about this aspect of the work of Stevenson. He's working with children, not all children, just some children who remember. Why do those children remember and most of us don't? We don't tend to remember our previous lives. These kids do. And it seems that the common factor is that pretty well all of these kids went through traumatic death, often untimely. Very clearly a life cut short, very short, in very heavy circumstances. And it just seems like there's something that needs to be continued. And they've too soon come back and still tuned into their previous life. But by the time they're 8, 9, 10, it's waned and they pretty well left it behind. They're now completely embedded in their new identity. And so extraordinary evidence. We mentioned Susan Blackmore before. Unfortunately, we got to quote her again. If human consciousness can really leave the body and operate without a brain, then everything we know in neuroscience has to be questioned. If people could really gain paranormal knowledge, then much of physics needs to be rewritten. That is what is at stake. Now, that doesn't sound a very objective view of things, that you're just worried about rewriting your textbooks. We're not asking you to rewrite the textbooks. Your textbooks shouldn't be saying anything about what happens, after death or how consciousness transmigrates. You shouldn't be having books on that. You can keep your books on everything else. Just stop making comments that consciousness and the mind come from the brain. That's all we're asking you to do. That's surely not too much of an imposition. Now, we talked earlier about selfhood. And this is important because this is an area of conflation. And Susan Blackmore and others feel, are prone to this, that they consider the self to be the experience or the self to be changed by experience, and it's a new self. So we're going to look a little at selfhood for a few minutes. These are different aspects. It's the idea of selfhood, a union of all the parts of our body, something that brings all this picture together in me. It's in the totality, the sense of myself, who I am, and identity. And identity can be in various terms. I have various identities. Of course, I got a name. I've got a family that I'm part of. I've got a community. I may have a religion. I may have, a job. I may have an interest. I may have a football club that it's all part of my identity. And overall, I think I'm part of the human race. Awareness of our own existence. That's fine. That's self-reflection. Now, this is an important one to distinguish in consciousness. Awareness of our own existence is a sort of meditation we did at the beginning, right? And we wanted to be very aware of our own existence. We really labored that. However, It is a form of metacognition. It's an introspection. We're introspecting this idea that I exist. We exist happily without doing that introspection. You get that? We don't have to introspect that I exist to exist. But when I do introspect, I realize, yep, got it right. I do exist. All right. So that's important when we look at other species, because not all species will have awareness of self or this self-awareness. But that doesn't mean they don't have consciousness. This is not a prerequisite for consciousness. It's a prerequisite for humans using their mind in order to verify the nature of consciousness. Individuality, yes. I saw a great mug once that said, "You are unique, just like everyone else." I think that's a great phrase. Yeah, that's really important. You are unique. You're absolutely individual, just like everyone else is. That's our uniqueness and personhood. You know, the idea that makes us think of ourselves as an individual person. And of course, I have all my particular personality traits. Anyone know the big five? I can never remember them all. Um, what? Anyway, it won't go, huh? The big five, yeah. Openness. C, conscientiousness. E, is that the aggression one? There's one that's kind of confrontational, eh? Assertive. Yeah, neuroticism. Yeah, that's the fourth. Yeah, assertiveness. Assertiveness is the A. Agreeableness. Well done. Thank you on Zoom and Google. So those are the personality traits that tend to make us up, and they form part of our personality, our personhood, our identity, the way we interact with everything, how we regard ourselves. They're not consciousness per se. This is the idea that consciousness has of itself. And of course, because we are an individual seeing conscious entity, we need to have a picture of who we are in order to place ourselves in the picture of the drama that is happening all around us. And we're going to get into that. I think that's this afternoon. So 3 theories on the self: rope, string of pearls, and the Atma. The rope theory is that there's no individual entity, there's no self. That what we call the self is simply the binding together of all these little strands, continuity of many overlapping mental events woven together. But that's not how we experience it. And that's why we go through those pre-philosophical exercises in order to understand, no, there's a rope happening. There's a constant flow of those experiences and events, but I'm the one watching them all. Similarly, their ideas that they're woven together. The other one is the string of pearls, which basically says these are all the different events, and just there's one, and that event produces that self. This is a new self, new experience. This is a new experience, new self, new experience. And basically, that's what there is. There's no continuity. But if you play that game, then what's the string that's holding it all together? It's one thing. Well, they would say that's the body. That's basically the body brain system that is generating these things. That's so they can get over that. But if I'm a different self to the person who existed even just a moment ago, why am I worried about the guy who's going to come next if it's not me? Why should I make plans for that? Why should I take responsibility for the guy down the line of time who did such and such? Why should I be blamed for that? So you get into a lot of a mess, and we'll talk about culpability in a minute. We have multiple selfhoods: the physical self, the personality self, the social persona self, the narrator self, even the moral true self. So these are different kind of images we have of ourselves. Some of them are based on our physical situation. Some of them are based on our personality. Some of them are social, how we interact with others. And that involves our family, our job, our friends, our community, and everything else. The narrator self. This is interesting. There is someone talking to you all the time inside your head, isn't there? Basically, our mind is speaking to us. It's narrating, and we take that as being us. But actually, we're hearing it as a conversation. And did you know that narrator has an accent? And it will be what you think your accent is. You hear your narrator voice in your accent. Now, how would you test that? The way they did it was to devise poetry that had rhyming couplets. But the rhyming couplets only work according to that accent. So the interesting thing was when you read them silently to yourself, do you hear the rhyme? Now, the best example I can give you is from a place in England called Newcastle, Geordieland, we call it. And they have a very, and I'm not good at accents, but they don't say town, they say tune. I'm going to tune, you know? So if you write, I am going to go to town to see what I can frown or something like that, that's terrible poetry. When you and I read that, if we read that silently, we will hear the rhyme. When they read it, I'm going down to tune to see what I can frown. What? Doesn't work, for them. So that's how they experimented, that our inner voice even has an accent that we like to hear. So the Atma, though, is the conscious self that observes and experiences all the other forms of selfhood. And we'll see how that comes about and how we develop that and how we kind of give in to this sense of self and forget about this aspect of our selfhood. So we want to focus, whatever we're going to do, we need to focus that as the Atma, we are the conscious self, and we need to see existence from that perspective. We are a singular entity of consciousness, the audience of the drama on the stage of consciousness, the witness of our thoughts, the observer of qualia in our inner life, and the unchanging permanent self. So how is it that we are kind of entranced? And it is by identification and immersion. That how are we captured by what the mind is doing? And how are we kind of forgetting our nature as a conscious entity and giving over to these other senses of who we are? And one example is, say you're here watching a movie on a screen, right? You've gone there with your friends. You're ready just to give yourself to what's happening on the screen. And it's one of these slasher horror movies, right? So guys coming up the stairs, and the family are hiding, and the guy's creeping up the stairs with the big axe, and just coming, and then suddenly, and then these guys go, ah! They're frightened, they're scared, or at least they're startled. Their emotions have changed. A moment ago, they were sitting, and now this happens. What has actually happened in reality to them as the viewers? Nothing. The only danger they have is spilling their popcorn. But they've allowed their emotions to be driven by what they're observing on the screen. They've identified so deeply with the circumstances of those characters and what it might be like to be there and to feel that and to experience, that this fright has come. But actually, they are discrete, they're detached viewers of the whole process. So the Atma relates to the mind in this way. And I've tried to do this one. This is not very good. I don't think it's come out very well. This is a kind of stage with all these guys doing stuff on it, right? That's the drama of that we experience in the world around us, right? People are doing things, and we are the observer, like we are in the movie. But that isn't good enough for us. You know, we don't just want to watch stuff. You know, we want to be there. We are subjective beings. Do you think we just want to watch other people doing things? No, we want to be in on the action. We inject ourselves onto that drama scene in our mind. We create a persona along with all these other guys. But this is the new persona that we're taking. And it includes all those other things, the physical self, the personality self, the social self, everything is defined according to what fits into that drama. That's the real self, the conscious self. This is the constructed version, the persona self, that around which all other selfhoods happen. So all of them, they're all feeding in. Everything that's going on is feeding in to that picture of who I think I am. And the trouble is, oh, we've lost, oh, we're back. The trouble is that the more we become enamored in how this self is getting on in this world, what happens is that this light and the sense of ourself as the conscious entity starts to diminish. And this aspect of the power of our senses feeding into the picture gets stronger and stronger and stronger until we get to the point where we think, really, this is me. I've forgotten and I have no vision of myself as the conscious entity. That is the me. This is my world. I know nothing else. And this becomes absolutely dominant, the input from the senses and the power of the picture that the mind is creating for us. So I'm actually just going to skip that. When we just, this gives us a kind of understanding of how we can understand the nature of consciousness and the importance of appreciating ourselves as the conscious being and how we then can relate to this persona self. We've all got it. We're all acting within it at this moment. You know, as much as we think we're enlightened, whatever, we're still acting within very much limited by this persona self. But we're trying at least to direct that persona self maybe in a new kind of direction. And we're trying to cope better with what the mind has got to offer. So we hope this picture that we've just created for you this morning helps, because it enables us to explore the nature of higher emotions. For instance, we all value issues of compassion, generosity, altruism, you know, kindness, and we all value love. So how do we do that within the brain model? How can we give value to those things within a model that says you are simply the product of your brain, that or maybe no self, there's no nature of anything else, you're just randomized activities of brain activity generating many selfhoods? It really erodes these other things that we value. So not only along with our pre-philosophical insights about the nature of ourself and how we experience the world, we've got to give credit to these higher emotions. And I would urge anyone, if you're going to follow a philosophy, please follow a philosophy and ideology that glorifies and validates these emotions that you have and encourages you on the expression of them rather than one that tries to deny it. And in that way also, that's linked to the whole sense of our purpose, of why we're here. Is there a meaning to being here? If we're simply just a product of biology and neuroscience and just the brain and the consciousness pops out, then what does that say about our existence and the purpose of our existence? We can try and construct meaning and purpose to it, but it actually becomes very hard. And we're we're near the end of this particular session. Just want to kind of show you this slide from New Scientist. You know, if my work helps just one person feel like a tiny, insignificant speck lost in a cold, uncaring universe, then I'm doing my job. He's managed to convey the actual message of his science. Tough. And that's from New Scientist, you know. So they understand there is actually it's understood that this is the reality. We're lost in a cold, uncaring universe. I know it doesn't fit with anything that you humans believe in, but this is the reality, you know? Anyway, question. So what do we really want? This is how we can understand the nature of the Atma. The things we want to be, that's our existence, right? We want to know stuff, that's why you're here. You know, we're always wanting to increase our knowledge. Why? Because it'll help us find what we want in terms of we want to love and we want to be happy. And these are related to three Sanskrit terms, Sat, Chit, Ananda, which of course are used to define the nature of consciousness. These define what is driving consciousness at its heart. That we want to be, we want to know, we want to love, we want to enjoy, we want to be happy, right? Everything drives from that. And we'll explore that in the afternoon session when we get to life a bit more. So, still to come, free will. How does matter work? Can intention affect matter? And then that's the next session. And then we have life and all sorts of things. So, where we're at now, we've got a few minutes for questions. Yeah.
Well,
You've been very good.
one thing is cartoon from New Scientist. That was a satirical self-reflection. I mean, it's a humor. Yeah, so they're aware, or at least, you know. And then there's a sort of thing there, like maybe I can convince one person. You know, so there's something to work with there. I think.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's revealing that, and that there's a lot of work these days on trying to bring wonder and meaning back into science. They want to improve their way of telling stories and kind of giving a picture, but unfortunately, the message is this, and it's a toughie, and it doesn't sit with our intuition. So therefore, they're struggling. Oh, sorry.
Way back, you were talking, raised about how visual processing is they calculate a half second lag, and there's something's going on this where it's filled in, and so you don't get left behind. But if there's two people interacting with each other, they each have a half second lag. So then there's a 1 second lag. You know, and let's say there's trapeze artists, and if they're just a microsecond lagging, you know, yeah, it's disastrous. And then both of their anticipatory powers have to be in tune. Because if I'm anticipating, you're anticipating, and we got to connect, or somebody drops. So how, you know, and then you have groups of people, and just, you know, and then the lag is perhaps building up. How would all that be handled?
That's a really, the question, I hope it got caught up for Zoom, is that if there is a time lag between one person experiencing what another has done or what another said, and then they speak, and there's an accumulation of time lags, how on earth does that work? And I think we looked into trying to create an experiment to see whether that was possible to look into. I think most people, researchers, have concluded that's not an avenue to go down, which is why they then come back to the predictive brain guessing or hallucinating.
Part of the brain in tune. I mean, I'm predicting, you know, just up a few million degrees and near off.
Well, that's how do they? Yeah,
Yeah.
we're getting into the areas where no one wants to talk about those problems because they're recognized, they're understood, and they're not resolvable unless you bring in another system that is able to overcome those deficiencies by bringing in new information from another source. And that's too much for.
Just someone's talking about this is well, every condition's soul, but as far as it goes with the sciences, some physicist was talking, when I was a graduate student, I started having some questions. There was a lecture on gravity, and and he was trying, and then what is gravity? So he goes to the professor afterwards. No, it's just Sadaputa brought this up. That's the science. And so he goes up and talks to the professor afterwards. What actually is gravity? And the lecturer told him, we don't want to go there.
Yes, that's another story, gravity.
So there's so many topics. Yeah, even basic stuff.
Yeah, you were talking about consciousness as being the unchanging, persistent. It seems like you're equating the Atma with the Atma is consciousness. Consciousness is us. I am consciousness.
Yes.
And it's unchanging. But sometimes we talk about the evolution of consciousness, material consciousness, spiritual consciousness. So how does that fit in?
Prabhupada uses consciousness in two different ways. Even the International Society for Krishna Consciousness tends to be interpreted as Krishna Chaitanya, which is consciousness of Krishna, is as an example. Whereas another way of understanding International Society for Krishna Consciousness is Krishna's consciousness. So there's the two ways of thinking of consciousness, either that which we experience or that who is doing the experience. And the evolution of consciousness that we may talk about is an evolution of Chaitanya, of the different levels and types of conscious interest and experience and expression that we will have. So that's what we want to vary. We want to vary the things that we're consciously interested in. We want to vary the way we interact with other things intentionally. So the expression of consciousness. So those are the things we want to evolve in. But the soul or the Atma doesn't ever change. It doesn't evolve into something else. But it's at the same time, instead of being, where are we? Oh, yeah. Instead of thinking that I'm that, at least if I think I'm the Atma, in one sense, that's an evolution of our own recognition. The Atma is never stopped being the Atma, never stopped being us, but at least we're now recognizing it. That's the evolution we want to go through. We will come to a little bit of that this afternoon, and I hope we answered that for you properly then.
Srila Prabhupada taught us that in India, people's Krishna consciousness is closer to the surface, means that they're less covered over than in other places. So now, if you go there, you find that even the common people on the street, they could be even poor or uneducated, but they all have like an inherent understanding of reincarnation and their place in the world. There was this one cartoon. There was a little kid about 6 years old sitting on the couch with an old man, probably his grandfather, and the little kid says to the elderly man, yeah, well, when I was your age, I didn't believe in reincarnation either.
Very good.
My question was, you were saying the Atma, the non-temporal observer of time. I didn't exactly catch the full meaning of non-temporal.
Non-temporal means it's not under the influence of time. It's not controlled by time. It's not changed by time. It's not within the jurisdiction of time. Another word for non-temporal is eternal. But non-temporal defines what we mean by being eternal. You're outside of time. Eternal, some people think of as just being a long, 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 long time. No. Eternal is non-temporal, means that time never gets you. Hasn't in the past, won't get you in the future. It can't. There is no past and present in that sense to change you. Time cannot touch you.
So back to the processing. So we see, like, it takes half a second for us to process visual data, and then we think maybe our brain holds off. you know, process or making us aware of the auditory data until we can.
But we're saying I think we're saying it doesn't hold, can't do that.
You, if we assume that it does hold it, or if we assume that we're receiving data half a second with half a second delay, then we can conclude that there's no free will.
What it mean? Yes, because what that would indicate is that if we're receiving things late and we're acting, as was said, in what appears to be real time, that means that your brain is doing all the reacting and you're just watching it. And therefore, you have no will or volition within the system. That's why people don't want to go down that route. And quite rightly. Yeah, because it means that, but well, it does in the sense that because you don't wait to react. There's a reaction much quicker. So how is that happening?
I see you're reading from the 40.
So that it means that this self that thinks it exists in their terms is the one that's experiencing later, whereas the body and brain is very happily getting on with things. But you, this thing that you think is a subjective self, is having to wait, and therefore it's really just a bystander. That's why they say that. It's yeah, it's definitely very confusing to the mind to meditate on this one.